virtual learning. So we thought, now that we get him back, to start a conversation on our campus, to look at how best we could establish a strong program that will benefit students and faculty as well. So we start this lecture series with our first speaker, Dr. Anthony Ogden. We are so pleased to have you here, Dr. Ogden. I'm thrilled. I know you do a lot of work. You have done a lot of work, and can't thank you enough for accepting our invitation to speak to our campus and obviously our international audience, our partners in Argentina, and I believe there will be some from Ethiopia as well. Dr. Ogden is founder and managing director of Gateway International Group. You could see the sign behind him. The Gateway International Group is a new organization which focuses on next generation international education. Dr. Ogden is a well-respected scholar and a practitioner. He has nearly 30 years of experience in international higher education. He held senior international leadership positions at Pennsylvania State University, University of Kentucky, Michigan State University, and the University of Wyoming. Dr. Ogden is a three-time Fulbright recipient. He completed his doctorate degree at Penn State University in educational theory and policy with a dual title in comparative and international education. He has produced over 60 professional and scholarly publications focused on international higher education, including a 2020 co-edited book, Education Abroad, Bridging Scholarship and Practice. He's going to talk to us today about the next generation of international education, where we have been and where we're heading. Dr. Ogden, welcome, and it's a pleasure again having you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Salih. It's really terrific to be here with you today. And I want to say, well, first, let me go ahead and share my screen. Am I sharing my screen now, I hope?
Yeah.
Very good. I want to say thank you once again, Dr. Salih, for having me here today. It's just a real honor to be with all of the good folks there at CSU Dominguez Hills. I really am so pleased that you've made time in your day. I also want to say thanks to Ormond, who did all of the heavy lifting behind the scenes, and she admonished me early on to tell me to behave today, and I promise, Ormond, I will not let you down. That said, I do promise to be a little edgy in my presentation to the extent that I can do that. So I really want to say thank you, and I'm glad you're here today. Now, you've already seen my little introduction there, and I thank you, Dr. Salih, for introducing me there. Now, what I'd like to ask, if I can, is to ask all of you to also introduce yourselves. If you are, if you're there at CSU Dominguez Hills, maybe just say your name and what department you're in, or if you're like Maria in Argentina, maybe where in the world you're at today and what brings you here. So I'm really glad to be with you. And I would like to be able, we have a small room here today, so let's be as interactive as we can. I do have some prepared slides that I'll walk through, but hopefully we can be very interactive. Now, again, a little bit about me, just to underscore, I consider myself more of a scholar practitioner in international education. And what that means for me is that I try to use, like a lot of us in higher education, I like to inform my practice through scholarship. And through that practice, I like to shape the scope and the direction of the scholarship in that cyclical process. And in international higher education, like so many other areas, it is so very important to have scholar practitioners in this work. Now, one of the books that Dr. Salih mentioned that came out just recently, that if this focus today is about education abroad, and it is an honor to be one of the first speakers in the series. This more recent book, if you're interested in scholar practitioner orientation, or in other words, how the scholarship informs education abroad as a practice or as a profession, that might be a good book for you. It's not terribly exciting read, but it is, each chapter is organized in the same way that you can use it as a reference guide. Some of these other things maybe not as exciting, but this one particularly is useful, I think, for those of you who are doing research on education abroad. And as Dr. Salih mentioned, I'm with a very small little group here called Gateway International Group. And I invite you to have a look there, but specifically there is one section on the website called Gateway Resources. It is a section that offers, as we curate really, it can as much information on international education from the latest books or the next upcoming events or meetings and such. Everything is there, is free and is open access. So if you're just wanting to kind of get a pulse of where things are right now in international higher education, with some level of specificity on education abroad, I invite you to have a look at that website. So anyhow, today, what I really want to do in the short time that we have together is to really focus first on sort of where higher education is right now, and then segue from that to next generation international education, and then look specifically at the new directions in international learning and engagement. Now, you might notice I'm not using that word study abroad or education abroad specifically. Instead, I'm using much more with specificity international learning and engagement. I think as we go along, you'll see what I mean by that. And just so, jumping in, now, I must say, I didn't see any of you yet write into the chat box there about who you are, what department you're in, so please don't be shy. Go ahead and weigh in if you'd like in the chat box. Okay, so as we've seen over the last couple of years, the pandemic, among other things, has really shifted higher education in its delivery. You'll see here, there have been so many permanent changes. We're seeing evolving, I think increasingly exciting. There we are in this, so thank you very much for that. Evolving approaches to student learning and engagement. We're seeing new technologies, enhanced technologies, new ways, new modalities for supporting student learning. We're seeing finally greater attention and prioritization to diversity, equity, and inclusion. This, as you might know, has been a focus of international education, specifically education abroad, since 1993 in a very explicit way. But if you look at our enrollment patterns, we really haven't changed since 1993, meaning that we really haven't been enrolling a greater proportion of traditionally underrepresented students. So I'm hoping now, because of all of the changes of late, that we're going to be able to see greater movement in that regard. But also, and importantly, what's happened is we have learned because of this pandemic that certain things really are important to be delivered in person. But other things actually can be delivered or facilitated even better in a virtual context or an online context, such as academic advising in certain ways, or some of our administrative services, that we don't always have to do everything between 9 to 5 in our remote offices on various parts of our campus. But as we know, in the last couple of years, we focused a lot of our attention on the pandemic. But in reality, the pandemic, as we now know, has really accelerated changes that were already in motion of the forces being driven by Industry 4.0. We already saw prior to the pandemic that students were pushing for more personalized learning, more remote learning. Our administrators wanted data at their fingertips. We were looking at formative assessment, new uses of technology, all of which has accelerated changes in higher education. And now we're having more serious or maybe more mainstream discussions about unbundling of degrees or micro-credentials or stackable qualifications. We're now also seeing a lot more acceptance of public-private partnerships. All of this is leading, I think, to new types of credentials, new ways of delivery, as well as new students on our campuses or in our programs. This is all fairly exciting. Now, what's happened, as you know, when we think about higher education, and oftentimes in the last 10 years or more, we've been thinking about higher education insofar as student success is concerned, right? Student success has often been described as first to second year retention and graduation, 4, 5, and 6 year graduation rates, right? If we can retain students to graduation and hopefully support their lifelong education and career development. And we've been focusing on that in two ways. Academic, well, this is actually stretching back to the 1960s, right? Academic integration and social integration. In other words, the more academically and socially integrated a student, the more likely they will have a greater student success or thereby graduating, right? But now, because of the pandemic and forces driven by Industry 4.0, now we have another level. I haven't seen a lot of research on this. This is my own thinking here, and that is, we will need to be more strategic, more focused on prioritizing not just academic integration and social integration, but leveraging virtual or online learning in new ways to support student success, all of which is still a pathway to what I think of as next generation international learning, right? So if this is in 3 minutes or less is sort of a landscape of higher education, it's at least here in the United States, then my question to you is, so then what is the purpose of international higher education? And how is it changing? So this is a key question that a lot of us, certainly Dr. Salih and others, are thinking about, and that is, what is the purpose of international higher education, and is it changing? So as we go along, feel free to use that chat function there and weigh in with your thoughts on this question. For me, I think the purpose of international higher education hasn't changed at all. We are still, our goal is still singularly focused on graduating students who understand the international nuances of their chosen discipline and are able to work successfully in an increasingly interdependent, globalized world, both with international competence, intercultural competence, and so on. That hasn't changed. Our goal is still to graduate all students with that understanding and that skill set to be successful lifelong learners. That is our goal. Now, the second part of the question, though, is, and how is it changing? Well, it certainly has. But let's first look back pre-pandemic. So today's topic is really, where have we been and where are we going, right? So if you look pre-pandemic, when you look at global student mobility, it was increasing year after year after year to more and more students from all parts of the world were pursuing education outside of their home education, their home countries, degree and non-degree programming. They were seeking, more and more students were doing this, right? And the reason being is we have been seeing over the last 25 years a rising middle class in various parts of the world. We've seen just an increasing number of college-ready students who have the means to be able to pursue education outside of their home country. We have seen dramatically so an increasing competition. And the United States, of course, each institution generally recruits for itself, whereas in other countries like New Zealand or Australia, we were seeing increasingly government orchestrated recruitment, incredible competition for international students for all sorts of reasons, financial notwithstanding. We also saw over the last 25 years increasing sophistication of technology and communication. How do we actually reach students who would pursue mobility, educational mobility? And then, of course, cross-border delivery. We've seen many of our campuses, US campuses, developing programs abroad, campuses abroad. Now, what we're seeing post-pandemic, of course, are these development of these what we call sort of micro campuses, like what the University of Arizona is doing, for example. We've also seen over the last 25 years increasing interest and prioritization of global competence, intercultural competence at the very least. And then, of course, we've also seen, thanks to the Bologna process and other initiatives, the prevalence of English taught curriculum. So it used to be that students would pursue study in an Anglophone country, but now you can take a degree in Germany completely taught in English, for example. And then, of course, we've also seen commercialization or commercialism happening in international higher education, all of which is to say that we have seen in the last 25 years There's universities have been pushing and pushing very hard to achieve world-class status, right? And we've seen that manifest primarily in rankings, global university rankings, QS, Times Higher Ed, and so forth. We've also seen our universities saying, no, we really have to network and be part of networks in our collaborative arrangements with institutions and organizations around the world. We've also seen a number of countries, many countries, in fact, that have created national policies on international education. Here in the United States, we don't have a national policy on international education. We have a three-part framing about why international education is important, but we don't have a written national policy. And that's why it makes it even more difficult for all of us here in the US to be able to advocate to our legislators about the importance of international education, especially education abroad. And then, of course, we've seen on the flip side of that, increasingly so here recently, in the last few years, rhetoric, isolationist and nationalistic rhetoric that actually work against the foundation of why we wish our students to engage internationally. And then, of course, we've also seen greater prioritization of research and data-driven decision-making, internationalization at home initiatives, and so much more. And that has led, for me at least, these types of questions that are so very important. And those are like, how have new forms of international programming expanded access? So if we think about where we are today, and we have all of these new modalities, how is that expanding access to all students to be able to participate in international learning and engagement? And then a question and a worry for me right now is, now that we're removing our masks and our students are back on campus and we're engaging, how are we going to avoid that temptation of returning to the way things used to be? Now, many of us secretly want to get back to the way things were, but especially in US education abroad, I sure hope we don't. Prior to the pandemic, we saw nationally less than 2 or 3% of students studying abroad. At schools like yours, we saw maybe less than 10% of students studying abroad. Again, if our goal is to graduate all students with international knowledge, skills, and perspectives, we really don't want to return back to the way things were, right? And we can talk a lot about that if time allows. And then also we want to think about, how do we pursue new partnerships? Prior to the pandemic, we had just a few ways. Oh, let's create an exchange program, or let's create some sort of a collaborative degree program. But now we have this opportunity to pursue new ways of engaging. And I hope we'll talk about that as well. And then finally, the research. Now we're seeing, I think, finally, after about 2 years, the publication of new scholarly research on looking at what are students learning in online programs, how to enhance the pedagogies to support that learning, and so on. So we're seeing new research. Now, all of this is leading then to what I see here just on the screen, just 4 types of things, but that is educational technology. We're seeing COIL programming. Now, if you're not familiar with COIL, that's an acronym that really means one thing, but people are using it, frankly, to mean a lot of things, but it really means collaborative online international learning. We can talk about that. And then we're seeing more and more collaborative degree programs, as well as course exchange alliances. Now imagine this. Up until the pandemic, if a student wanted to study abroad, they had to go abroad, right? And now, but if a student just imagine if a student just wants to take that one course that's not offered there at CSU, but that one course, they don't really want to go all the way to Japan to take that one course. They just want one. But now, because of the technology and these other forms of collaborative degree programs and collaboration generally, we're seeing students able to enroll in just one course as part of their degree, as part of a semester registration. That's pretty amazing, talking about access. So, where are we now? for me, the question is, what are the major questions driving international learning and engagement today? Now, this could be a long list, but let me just be very brief here. And that is, how can we, shifting emphasis, how can we leverage or how can we expand from mobility-based programming to include other forms of learning, right? Or how can we drive participation to be more reflective of the students on our campuses? How can we leverage new technologies to enhance our program, our operations, our student learning, and so on? And then how can we leverage new or more mainstream modalities to expand learning for all students? And then how can we enhance the learning that happens? In other words, let me be very clear here. We have focused heavily for 2 years on modalities. In fact, if you think about it, for education abroad, we have been focusing on modalities for a long time. But here, only recently have we started talking about pedagogy. How do we leverage pedagogy? That we don't need new pedagogies here. We need to be able to be more effective in how we are delivering these programs online. Now, let me explain this in a different way. Think about international learning and engagement as a continuum. Up until the pandemic, when we would talk about education abroad specifically, we were really thinking along these lines. Mobility education. They had to get on a plane and go somewhere. I guess in California, they could get on a ship and go somewhere too, but nonetheless, they had to get on a plane generally and go somewhere. And then our goal was to maximize opportunity. So we made all of these education abroad programs available, and those students who could avail themselves of these opportunities could participate, right? And mostly that was white, middle to upper class female students. That was who it was, and who it has been for a long time. But that said, we said, well, let's make all these opportunities available so that more students can participate. That was our goal. But now, because of the pandemic, because of the acceleration of factors related to Industry 4.0, we're now seeing this continuum expand. And what I call, for lack of better terminology, you have mobility education, but now also access education. And this is where we can leverage online programming and all of these new and exciting things that I mentioned earlier, like COIL and virtual exchange alliances and so on, to be able to allow a greater diversity, a greater number of students to participate in international learning and engagement, right? So, so rather than just maximizing opportunity, we're maximizing access. And then, of course, the continuum is expanding to saying, hang on, imagine a world where a student is just registering for their class, any old class. And as part of that class, all of a sudden, they're working in multinational teams with students in Argentina, with Maria, and students over in Japan and all the rest. And now we can do that, and students are no longer just opting in, but it becomes part of their curriculum. We have talked about this for 20 plus years now, more so in a European context, about internationalization in home. But now, because of the more mainstreaming of modalities like COIL and so on, we can see more of our students developing a more pronounced, more robust international understanding of their disciplines, right? So in a sense now, what we have are 3 buckets, right? So we have mobility education, we have access education, and now we have integrated education. We don't just have one. Now you might be saying, well, Tony, no, studying abroad is still really very important, and it is the best way to engage students in learning. That may be so. We don't have the research to show that, but that may be so. But that doesn't keep us from thinking broadly along this continuum to think, how do I leverage this continuum? How do I leverage all the new and expanded robust tools that we have to be able to ensure that all students graduate? hence reaching our goal, right? So that's sort of what I really want to impress today, and what I have seen almost every institution now, and I'm sure the same at CSU Dominguez Hills, is also looking at how do we leverage the broad possibilities along this continuum. Now, but some of you may still think, oh, I don't know, I really wish the way that we used to do things was still better, and we should really just get students abroad. Well, let me give a little sort of history lesson. I've been engaged in education abroad work for a long time, my entire career. I set out to do this as a career. And if you think about it, after World War II in the 1940s, mostly we focused on junior year abroad, JYA. Maybe some of you participated in JYA programs, right? Our goal was to get these girls abroad to France, let them wear a beret, smoke a cigarette, and learn a few words of French. That was our goal. That was the goal. Junior year abroad, get them abroad. That was the whole point, just get them abroad so they might learn a little bit of culture, may learn a little bit of language. And then around the early 90s, we said, hang on a minute, we could probably create more access to students if we offered semester length programs, just one semester. And then sure enough, we said, yeah, that'll work. And more students grew and more students participated, that the numbers went up. More students were saying, look, we were saying as educators that it not just increases the number of students, but also increases where they can study. Keep in mind, during the JYA, it was all Europe. It's still predominantly Europe, but nonetheless, that has decreased because now they can go abroad for one semester. For many years, I was the director of a center in Japan, and I would have students coming over and for 1 year and then increasingly for one semester, right? And then back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we said, let's grow programs in the summertime. Oh, if some of you might remember this, but you would have thought it was heresy. Oh, we cannot offer summer programs. You cannot do it, cannot do it. And because if we do it, students will never become interculturally competent. But nonetheless, we pushed ahead, and sure enough, short-term programs of less than 8 weeks took off. And then it took us a long time, but we realized that it's not about duration. It's about the goals of the program. So if your goal is to become fluent in Japanese, you probably should study abroad for a year or longer, right? But you're not going to become fluent in Japanese in a 2-week program. So we realized right away that we had to shift the goals of what it is that we wanted to achieve, and then be able to design the programs around that, right? Hindsight is 2020, right? And then we started seeing over the last 15 years or more, people like me said, oh no, we really got to get the faculty on board. The faculty need to support education abroad programs. And they did. Faculty responded. And they responded by developing cohort programs. A faculty member takes a group of 12 to 15 students abroad for 2 or 3 weeks. And there was a whole world of problems associated with that, from reciprocity, ethical learning, and community engagement, and all the rest. But then it would also open up a lot of opportunity for students to be able to study their discipline in context, right? So it was great. Now we're at yet another stage in this development, and that is about online learning and engagement. Now we can leverage mobility-based programming, traditionally since the 1920s, up to now, and now we have new ways of engaging learning. So this has been the trajectory. Does anybody have a problem with this? One thing I really want to stress is that this has never been a smooth process. At every juncture here, people like me, our hair caught on fire. Well, I used to have hair. It caught on fire, we would be all crazy, right? Oh no, this is going to be the end of education abroad. The reality is it's continuing to develop, it's continuing to expand, and that is a good thing. Now, we have a lot to learn. For example, Remember that phrase, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig? Well, if you remember, not even 2 years ago, when the pandemic set out, a whole bunch of us education abroad folks said, oh, hell, what are we going to do? Students can't go abroad. So we thought, oh, we know what we can do. We can put these internships programs online. And that's what we did. We just put lipstick on that pig and threw it up online and hoped for the best. It didn't take a few minutes for us to realize that was crazy. That you can't just take a program and put it online and expect the same level of outcomes, right? And so now there's a whole lot of, this is just an example, but now we see folks saying, what's the difference between remote or in-person international internships, right? So what's the difference? And then if you look here, like in person, when you design a program or an internship in this example for in-person delivery, it has a whole different set of outcomes, and it will draw a whole different type of student population. Some students, depending on what they want to learn and achieve, really the only option they have is to do an in-person program. Now, for other students, it might be, depending on what they want to learn or achieve, they don't need to get on a plane and go somewhere. They could do what they need to do completely in a remote context, especially as we are doing today. Many of you are probably working from home today. We are able to do much from home. And now we're seeing more and more companies like my own that's completely online. I have interns working for Gateway right now. It's completely online, and that might be the only way for them to engage with Gateway. It's an online internship or a remote internship. So these are the types of thinking that I think is very important. And it seems a bit silly when I explain it like this, right? But this is where we are in our trajectory with education abroad. So I'm going to stop talking in a minute, I promise, but I'll be very, very quick to wrap this up. So in summary, the pandemic has changed a lot. But if you look about education abroad in particular, what we did 5 years ago was different than what we did 5 years before that. What we do today is going to be very different from what we're doing in a few years hence. And it's because there's always contextual factors that are constantly shifting, creating opportunity, closing some opportunity. We see our economy constantly shifting, and that depends, and that impacts who will be able to study abroad. We see our politics constantly shifting, opening and closing scholarship schemes, for example. We see our campuses are becoming much more representative of our total population, and because of that, we need to be thinking differently so as to engage all students. We know that there are different push and pull factors, and so on. The list goes on, which means then that we as educators have to be much more strategic in thinking about international learning engagement in its broader context. As faculty members, your goal is not to get students on airplanes. Your job is not to have students study abroad. Your job is to educate students and make sure that their studies are representative of the world. And so to be able to map student learning engagement on a trajectory is very important. Here's some of those key questions, and that is how can increasingly diverse learners be motivated? What program modalities should be prioritized? At what degree juncture should they be, or these strategies be leveraged? Where? Mobility-based, virtual, online, course level programming, and then what modalities and so forth will be mainstream for you. So in summary, I think it's a very, very exciting time to be working as an international educator. The pandemic has certainly disrupted our profession, and for many people who lost jobs and everything, it's been really disruptive, but it's also opened up opportunities. Here we see there are new contexts for international partnerships. We see new technologies every day. My mind is a little muddled by all of these new technologies. It's exciting at the same time. We see new modalities, new pedagogies. We see new stakeholders. We see new voices among those who want to learn. And also we see new policies, and the list goes on and on and on. So I know I talked about 10 minutes longer than I wanted to, but let's I would like to invite any of you to unmute yourself or use the chat or whatever else, because I imagine there's much that you might agree with what I said, but there's probably a lot that you disagree with as well. So let's share some of your thoughts at this point, or any questions or thoughts that you might want to offer. And I know Maria is going to kick us off. Maria, I have to tell you, I see you right in the middle of my screen. That's why I keep saying your name. But I never studied abroad until I was older, until I was actually in my late 40s. I decided I wanted to study abroad. I had been working in education abroad for years. And so I enrolled in a study abroad program as a student and in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And I tell you, I really had a great time. It was rather intimidating, but I really had a great time studying there in Argentina. It's a wonderful place.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. Thank you to Ormond and to Hamad, and thank you for allowing me to say a few words. It's good to know that you've been in Argentina at least once, and
many times.
I totally agree with you on what you are saying. Sorry for my English, first of all. The thing is that I've been managing the international office at my institution for around 7 years. And before and mainly during the pandemic, I understood that we are not a tourism agent, you know, we must work towards internationalization at home. So mainly. So the pandemic gave us the opportunity to use technologies more than ever, with virtual learning, with virtual internships, with collaborative online international learning, and many other tools. My appreciation is what is going to happen after the pandemic. Are we still going to take advantage of these technologies so as to give the whole university, students, professors, and researchers, the possibility to live and experience international activities at home? Because you mentioned many initiatives or many possible activities related to internationalization or international higher education. We can use all of them. I am sure that it is better to travel, to meet people, to exchange experiences in person, of course. But at least in Argentina and in my institution, only 1% of people are able to travel. Not only because of money, but also because of professions or personal issues. So I think that it is a great challenge for us to understand what the pandemic gave us, what the pandemic said, and what is not going to happen, and or something that shouldn't happen, shouldn't change, you know, regarding the use of technologies. Because as you said, I understand that it is not the same to do an internship abroad than working in home office, what we say. No, now I am at home and I have to rush to the university in 2 minutes. But international virtual activities give us many other, help us to develop many other skills that maybe we will not be able to experience and learn them in person. So I think that both of them are really important, because, you know, we've been working in an international initiative with 2 universities, one from the United States and one from France, related to this, to let people work in teams, to try to solve real problems from real institutions, from real businesses, working in teams, taking into account the difference of time, the differences related to culture, related to language, related to how we connect with other people, how we relate with other people, and all virtually, you know. And I am sure that the 95% of these people wouldn't be able to have an international experience if university do not allow them to do it at home, because they will not be able to travel. And it's good to understand that sometimes, and mainly with the United States, as you were saying, study abroad is something really, really important. And I understand that the policy, the government policy, pays a lot of attention to this, but it is not the only tool, and sometimes it's the most difficult way to encourage a relationship with an American university, because your system is wonderful, but it's really very different from others. You have everything in campus, you know,
which is why we need to engage in international learning and engage in partnerships such as with institutions like what you represent, Maria. I think the real key message is it all depends on what we want our students to learn and to be able to achieve, and then we use the modalities or the pedagogies effectively to achieve that. Up until now, we have been a one-stop shop. Get them on a plane, get them on a plane, as somehow, as if being in the vicinity of international events would in of itself promote international learning, intercultural learning. Being in the vicinity is not enough. So now what however, we need to do is to think about all of the opportunities available to us. Let me hear from a few other folks here. What are your thoughts today?
Tony, if I may, taking my power as someone who organized this, who is the driver in this change? Is it faculty? Is it the administrator? Of course, the student is important. But in the United States, for example, curriculum belongs to departments. So in the end, what we've been seeing so far up to this pandemic is that the drivers have been, to a large degree, faculty. Do we need for this new chapter, if that faculty is the person who is going to drive this, to train them in new skills and new modalities, or we just go along with the change? So actually I have two questions. Who is going to drive this change in the next? And specifically, what is the role of an administrator, somebody who is in charge of international education? And then if this is faculty driven, what about the skill sets that we have to sort of make sure that we are leading this in the right way?
You know, this is an important question that probably all of us here hearing that question have some thoughts too. My thoughts are to the first part of your question is, without doubt, faculty own and control the curriculum. And if you want to support international learning of any kind, an administrator must essentially work with and through the faculty. Full stop. There is no other way. You cannot have administration drive the curriculum. You never can. It will never, it might be short-term gains, but certainly not long-term change. Now, the reality though is, as I mentioned, the pandemic has accelerated a lot of changes, right? But those changes are already in motion through Industry 4.0. We've already seen huge shifts to the unbundling of degrees, stackable credentials, and all micro credentials, all this type of stuff I mentioned briefly earlier. We have already seen companies like Google and all of this are really changing that landscape of higher education. And students and learners, lifelong learners, are responding to it. Part of the challenges will be that faculty members generally we have got to look at what students want to learn and how they want to learn. And now we have an opportunity. Case in point, COIL. COIL programs have been around for 20 years. But now all of a sudden everybody's talking about COIL. Now the times have changed to allow us to do that. So we don't want to lose the opportunity to partner, we meaning administrators, partner with our faculty in supporting whatever they need to support student learning and engagement. That's our job. Now, administrators are oftentimes, I'm sorry to say, are oftentimes a problem or a barrier. We love to throw up bureaucracy, we love to throw up process, but the reality is we also need to make sure that we don't allow our structures and our systems to get in the way of common sense or good progress. If we think about it, most international offices in this country are structured by fees, student fees, and those fees are tied to mobility. So when you have online learning and engagement, for example, and there are no fee structures in place, then there's no revenue to your office. And as more and more offices are revenue generating, so if you don't make any money for these types of other programs, you're not going to do them, right? It's not in your business interest to do it. We need to think of new structures, new systems to be able to support our faculty in realizing what the goals that they have for their students.
Dr. Ogden, Dr. Anthony Thaddeus from United States Africa Institute has a question. It's in the chat room, but Dr. Thaddeus, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamoud. Hello and greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for this great presentation, Dr. Anthony. My name is Thaddeus with the U.S. African Institute. We are an organization that promotes the academic collaboration and partnership between American and African universities. As you can read in the chat, the traditional study abroad programs, has been Eurocentric, and even my experience, when I was in college. I was raising the same issue. They were sending us to different, Asian or European universities, not other institutions like in Africa or in Central or American countries. So, but how can we diversify international education and then study abroad program? And then please, talk about the, decolonizing, this, approach in the study abroad, and then how, and also the digital divide, in most African countries, for instance, or in Central American countries, the digital divide, has a huge impact, in virtual learning and study abroad, programs. Can you all please talk, those, issues?
Well, that is thank you very much for that question, sir. I must say that I was pleased to read it in the chat. I used to live in West Africa myself, and I know just how wonderful that region of the world is for our students and others to be able to learn and expand their world views. I wrote a paper some years ago called "The View from the Veranda." I just quickly threw in a link there into the chat. This paper was really speaking to, frankly, what I call the colonial system to support and reinforce colonial students. And we don't have a lot of time now to go into all of that, but there has been a great deal of research and emphasis here very recently on understanding how to decolonize the curriculum and how to decolonize education abroad. There are a number of really wonderful books and articles that have come out very recently that really speak to answering your question there. I think it is very, very important. Education abroad has been Eurocentric. It has been, in fact, if you look back to 1968, when you had Ivan Illich go to tell a group of American students to stop coming here and selling your American middle-class way of life. We have been talking about this for a long time, but I think it's only here in recent years that we've seen greater movement to decolonizing education abroad in all of the many ways of doing that, everything from language to community-based learning and so on. I think your question is very important. I invite you to have a look there at that article that I wrote some years ago. I didn't send it to everybody. I'm sorry. Let me try to now send it to everybody. And then if you want to write to me as well, I can send you a reading list of some of those other articles. By the way, I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, Gateway Resources, a section on my website. It has a number of foundational reading lists. So if you're kind of just curious about what are the seminal readings in education abroad, for example, you can go there and it tells you what are the seminal articles or books in these particular thematic areas. And there are other foundational, they're just PDFs. You can open them up and print them if you'd like. We have just a little bit more time. Other thoughts, accusations, disagreements?
Tony, if you'd like to stay longer, we can extend it a little bit. I know you're busy, and yeah, so we could open it to have more discussion. I see a lot of some of our faculty, maybe they would like to ask some question as well. Wonderful. Maybe I'll ask you a question, Tony, about how do you capture internationalization in the curriculum? What are some of the ways we could, because what we are doing with the virtual learning is set learning outcomes.
Let me give you a very quick, two quick answers to that. When I started at the University of Kentucky years ago, now let's be honest, Kentucky is not the bastion of things cosmopolitan, okay? So I started this little school in Kentucky, University of Kentucky, and there were just a few hundred students studying abroad. Within 2 years, I moved from a few hundred students studying abroad to 1,400 students in 2 years. How did I do that? I didn't do any great new promotion. How did I do it? The answer what I did was very, very specific. I went to every department head. I personally sit down with every single department head and generally with the faculty. And I said, do you want your students to study abroad? Yes or no? Now, if they said yes, I said, okay, great. What do you want them to study abroad? Well, we want them to take these courses, these types of things. I said, okay, great. When do you want them to do that? They said, well, we really want them to do it at this time. And then fast forward, for every single degree at the University of Kentucky at the time, I created a degree plan, the 8 undergraduate degree plan, the 8 semesters stacked. And I said to the students, this is when you should study abroad. These are the courses that you should take abroad. And here are the programs where you can take them. And we grouped the programs along with the faculty directed programs to exchange programs to third-party provider programs and so on. We had the range so that the students had diversity of selection, but every one of those programs would allow students to take those courses. So that's what happened. And then not only did the total numbers increase, because it was integrated into the curriculum, it became an expectation of the curriculum. And so every single student at like preview nights during admissions and recruitment to during a welcome orientation, they got that degree plan that had education abroad written into it. So then what happened was our traditionally underrepresented populations, for example, Pell eligible students, first generation college students, particular racial and minority populations, and so on. What I found was that within a few years, every single population that we tracked had equal percentage to the population itself at the university. Meaning, in other words, for example, first generation college students were no longer underrepresented in education abroad because we integrated it into the curriculum. Now, to the individual course level, that's a whole different thing, right? That is, I mean, it was one thing to get acquiescence at the department level for the major, but to bring faculty on board was a whole different thing. And so I made and have made over the decades at every semester until recently when I started Gateway, up until now, every single semester for the last 30 years, I've taken groups of faculty members abroad for a thematic program. And I've always gotten external funding for it, but a thematic program, and generally faculty members who had no international experience. And so they went abroad, usually cohorts of about 10 to 12, and we studied and achieved something together. And I think that's very, very important. If you really want to impact and engage faculty in international learning, you have to engage them in international learning so that then therefore they can support and encourage their own students. Now, California is a very sophisticated place, and maybe you don't need something like that. But that said, it is important, again, to engage the faculty. If you want to do anything with the curriculum, you have to engage the faculty. And of course, you have to look at your undergraduate core curriculum too. That's a whole different thing, but there are many other ways.
Hi, this is Rama Maladi. I'm a finance faculty. I was an international student previously, and now I'm a faculty working on international programs. I think there are two diametrically opposing views, especially from the student perspective when it comes to international experience. And I think most people are not familiar who are involved in these international educations about these experiences. For example, when a US student is going abroad, most of the time they're looking for an experience of learning about some other country, culture, etc. Whereas a student is coming to the US for international education, they are normally looking at one of three things: either opportunities for jobs and etc., or some, especially undergraduate education is a prestige in some countries. So they want undergraduate education in the United States. So prestige is a driving factor, opportunities are a driving factor. Or sometimes they are just escaping a very discriminatory system or oppression in their countries. So we have now reverse discriminations in a lot of countries. It is evident in Ukraine, for example, there are 20,000 students from India pursuing medicine. They say they're studying in Ukraine because they cannot get a medical seat in their country. So you have these very different lenses that students have when it comes to international education. The challenge is when the US faculty or US administrators, they are looking at international education, they are looking at mostly from the experience perspective, and they are missing these other three aspects of international perspective.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for your question, and it's terrific, especially to have someone from finance on the call today. Thank you very much for that. I think what your question really speaks to is a perennial question, and that is really related to our push and pull factors. I mentioned that earlier as a contextual issue of constant change. And in other words, what we consider push and pull factors are what are the factors in a person's home country that is pushing them out to seek education outside of their home country. Sometimes it might be access to education, especially for women, or it could be access to higher quality education. It could be access to more stable education, and so on. There are many push factors that are constantly in flux, and they vary by country. And then you have to look on the flip side of that, what are the pull factors? What, in this case, what pulls a future finance professor to the United States? What pulls you here? It could be our rankings. It could be the freedom of access, or at least voice in higher education in this country. It could be many reasons that pulls a student here, funding opportunities, whatever, or career opportunities. There are a lot of push and pull factors. One of the challenges, given that today's topic is about education abroad, is that we really haven't focused enough of our thinking on what pushes our students to study abroad, or what pulls them to particular countries for where they're studying abroad. And keeping in mind, most of when we think of international students in this country, we think almost without exception to degree-seeking students. When we think of education abroad for our students, we always think about it as part of their higher education program, not as a degree. So we actually have very, very few international students, few American students seeking degrees abroad. Part of it is we don't have reliable data, but also we just don't see that happening very often. Now, that said, there are a number of organizations. I've actually written a couple of articles about it here last year about why students should seek degrees abroad, but it's very, very small numbers. Now, about the push factors, I've often said, now you're going to probably think this is crazy, I've often said you should never ask an American student where they want to go. You should never ask them where they want to go, because who cares where they want to go? Our job as educators, we really ought to ask them, what do they want to learn and be able to achieve and do, and then focus secondarily on where they might be able to do that, or what type of program that might give them that access to that type of learning or to be able to achieve those outcomes. We often think about, as Maria kindly said at the outset of the call, we often think about education abroad as in a chance to see the world, or as you said so eloquently, Professor, and that is about experiences. I don't care about experiences. My job is not to give experiences. My job is to educate students and to make sure that they graduate with and to be successful lifelong learners and engaged citizens. That's my job. That's your job. We don't care about experiences. I don't care. My job is not to get warm bodies on airplanes. And I think we perpetuate that rhetoric in how we engage our students, and those days have got to stop. I said I was going to be edgy, didn't I? I'm watching Rachel. She's smiling and cringing all at the same time.
Thank you so much, Tony. Any questions? Maybe a last question. So we'll let you go, Dr. Ogden. Anyone? I don't see anyone in the chat or raising their hands. Tony, it's really a pleasure. I can't thank you enough. This is fantastic. I took really a lot of notes. I have a lot of questions. When we get together soon, we'll discuss them further, but this has been a pleasure, and I can't thank you enough on behalf of the school, on behalf of Maria in Argentina, and our wonderful partners, United States Africa Institute.
Well, it is indeed a pleasure, my pleasure. Everybody, thank you so much for being so patient and listening to my ramblings today. I really appreciate it. Now, I know you probably thought this guy was a little crazy, and you probably disagree with much of what I'm saying, and that's okay. This is why we have these discussions, really, to think about some new ways of engaging our students and our colleagues in international learning. So I appreciate your making the time. I've put my correct email now in the chat. Feel free to write to me if you want to pick up on anything that I've spoken about today, or things that you'd like to share with me. I'd welcome it. Everybody, thank you very much. Have a good afternoon there. I think it's about lunchtime for you now, isn't it? Almost there. Yeah, almost there. Thanks, Tony. Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.